He dropped the folder onto her desk as if it were a mistake he could not wait to erase. Papers fanned across the polished wood like a small ordinary storm. The sound was casual, sharp, a punctuation to the sentence he loved to end. "You're invisible, Maya. Try to stay that way." Maya Bennett picked up one sheet, slid her thumb along the margin where a neat script read, "Whitcomb Annual Gala, Guest List." The ballroom lights outside the glass wall made the ink look like a promise. Around them, the room hummed with clinking glasses and low-rehearsed laughter. Nathaniel Cole's heels clicked on the marble as he left, each step a metronome of entitlement. Someone nearby, a junior partner, laughed with the wrong kind of loudness. Cameras angled up toward the stage where the company's logo glowed like an altar. For a moment, the world reduced to those three beats: the folder, the heels, the laugh. If you like comeback stories, subscribe. She did not look up. She folded the paper back exactly where it belonged. There was a small photograph tucked beneath the stack, an old black and white of a woman in a tailored suit standing in front of the company's first office, a building no taller than a townhouse. On the back, in a hurried hand, the single word, "For May, when the time comes." Everyone called her the secretary. It was shorthand, a label he liked because it kept her small and tidy. A human filing cabinet he could arrange with a satiated air of control. He called her Maya in passing. Clients never saw her name on the marquee. She managed calendars that felt like the company's pulse, answered questions she was not supposed to answer, and knew, down to the color palettes, the quarterly anxieties of men who pretended their anxieties looked like victories. If you watched closely, you could see how she lived in two registers at once: the outward, where smiles were smooth, and the inner, where she cataloged details others discarded. The board secretary, the efficient switchboard, the woman who refolded napkins with precision. The inward Maya kept a drawer with a small box of things no one assumed would belong to someone who swept the corridors and carried coffee. Old receipts from a founding era, a name scratched inside a book, a letter she had never shown anyone. Clues, not confessions. Nathaniel loved big gestures. He loved grand entrances and public absolutes. He loved naming people in the public square and watching them react in real time, as if humiliation were a form of ownership. That night he gave a speech about vision and expansion, and, with a smile designed to cut, thanked our ever-present right hand, showing the assembled crowd a slide, a snapshot of Maya's desk, taken unannounced, a pixelated testament to her endless, unseen labor. The applause that followed felt like a bribe. The implication hung in the air, visible enough to be wounding. Later, when the champagne thinned and the string quartet slid into a softer key, Maya walked home in the kind of rain that announced itself by sound. The city took pity on her heels. She kept her face small and her shoulders broader than her wrists. She had, for years, learned how to make her life a series of careful economies, of speech, of exposure, of trust. In the weeks before the gala, the company had been buzzing about mergers and a new slate of board candidates. Nathaniel paced in meetings like a caged conductor. His pronouncements fell like oak leaves, thick, inevitable, somewhat decorative. He loved to assign blame in public and forgiveness in private, and so long as he controlled both, no one could predict the weather in his orbit. There was a hint of the other history in the way some older aides looked at Maya. Agnes, the retired secretary who had served the founder when the company still kept its windows open in summer, caught Maya's eye one morning by the coffee station and gave a small nod. It was the sort of nod that recognized a particular kind of endurance. "You carry it like she did," Agnes said once, voice creased like a well-read page. Maya only smiled because a smile was all that fit into a coffee break. Clues nestled in the margins of her life, small and patient. An envelope in a locked safety deposit box she was shown once as a child by a woman who had taken her hand and said, "Keep this for a day, you will need proof." A signature that matched the crest on a plaque in the alumni room. A phone contact named Trust Private that she never opened in front of others. The truth was engineered to be plausible. A branch of the Whitcomb family had quietly folded into anonymity. A founder who feared leverage and publicity had placed legal instruments in cold safekeeping, instructing a confidant to keep the beneficiary unknown until certain conditions were met. It was tidy and legal. Trust law, notarized affidavits, an executor with brittle integrity. Maya had come to the company because she believed in economy and competence. The job as executive assistant had offered rhythm. She knew how to make calendars that breathed and how to prepare dossiers that made men look omniscient. It gave her a vantage point where the company's architecture revealed itself in footnotes, quiet enough to let her learn its shape. Emma Hart had been her friend first. They had shared the same cramped coat closet for years, eaten bad takeout in the conference room after late nights, and traded stories like passwords. Emma was effervescent in a way that made human beings relax. She called people by nicknames and made the entire office sound less like a machine. She had a laugh that filled corners. Emma promised loyalty the way some people promise to be early, casually, with assumed inevitability. Nathaniel saw Emma the way proud men saw trophies. He liked her audacity, the way she could laugh in the face of a mistake and make the world think it was a joke worth keeping. He began to look at her during meetings and then leave the room with the lightness of someone who had found a private island. No one acknowledged the slow drift at first. A spark, the office whispered when their hands briefly brushed in the elevator. Harmless, others said when Emma suddenly took on extra lunches with Nathaniel's team. Loyalty, it turned out, was a commodity, and Emma traded it for proximity. The first real bruise came quietly. An email, short, corporate, icy, accused Maya of misfiling a confidential memo. The memo, Nathaniel announced with the theatrical calm of a man arranging his cufflinks, had appeared in an investor packet. The error was small, ambiguous, a misattached document that cost nothing and raised tempers. He called it negligence. He called for an audit. He did both in public. Maya apologized in the hallway to the intern who had the misfiled memorandum under his arm. She felt the apology as if it were something extraneous, an etiquette exercise for other people's needs. Nathaniel used the moment to remind the staff of accountability and the audience to applaud the structure that protected the company from its own small failures. Then, as if to ensure the humiliation had teeth, he announced Emma's promotion at a crowded breakfast meeting, sliding a new job description across the table where Maya sat. Emma took the offer with a bright, immediate gratitude that sounded almost like survival. She hugged Maya, and for a second the smile on Emma's face frayed. There was shame tucked into it like a hidden seam. Maya, for her part, nodded with the placidness of someone who understood that dignity, when measured by the world, was elastic. The accusation prompted an internal investigation. It served the company a narrative of diligence, and the office a narrative of risk managed. For Nathaniel, it was theater with collateral. He could remind the room who controlled consequences while clearing a space for Emma to step forward like an appointed heir to his favor. When the board announced Maya's suspension pending investigation, the word suspension sounded like a verdict in the cafeteria. Phones buzzed less. People shifted their papers as if suddenly afraid to touch anything she had touched. The informal calendar entry that marked her tasks became an empty cell in the company's rhythm. It was the strangest kind of exile, complete removal without the violence of firing. She was benched, visible as absence. She went home with a plastic bag full of half-finished lunches and the photograph with the coded script on the back. For a week she received no calls from colleagues. Emma's messages were sparse, supportive, perfunctory. Nathaniel delivered a pointed, sympathetic text, public concern, private distance. It read like a parent's polite dismissal of a child's theatrics. What they did not know, what they could not conceive, was that Maya had never been without avenues. The trust her grandmother had tied up in neat legal knots did not evaporate at a human finger's wave. Legal instruments, by design, were stubborn things. They required procedure, a chain of custody, signatures and witnesses, but they were also precise. A trust named a beneficiary, a notarized codicil whispered conditions into the right ears. To those with patience, they were a reservoir. Bank accounts, sealed letters, and the quiet recollection of a woman named Alden Hayes, the family's lawyer, formed the scaffolding of possibility. Alden had been the keeper of many uncomfortable secrets. He was the kind of man who kept his opinions folded in the same way he kept his documents, flat, unornamented, and ready to be produced as proof. When Maya called him, she did so with the small economy that had defined her life. Her voice did not tremble. "I expected the call," Alden said, and the ease of his reply did something like a temperature change in the room. "Good. We have been waiting for the conditions to be met." Maya's plan was not a plan in the way a heist is a plan. No masks, no quick hands, no soulless precision. It was the leveraging of lawfulness, trustee protocols, executory clauses, shareholder agreements that allowed an heir to assert certain protections. The founder, Eleanor Whitcomb, had been careful in life and brisk in death. She had loved her company like an old instrument, tuned, cared for, and preserved. She had also loved discretion. That love for privacy explained why Maya's name had not appeared on any letterhead or plaque. It explained the empty envelope in a safety deposit box and the way a single word could be enough to move mountains when paired with a legal signature. Alden was not a magician. He was a steward. He told Maya plainly that there were steps, time-bound, clerical, painfully boring, that had to be followed. He arranged for a preliminary review. That review, once completed, would not make her owner, not yet. It would, however, make her eligible to act in certain capacities. It would give her a seat at the table far enough to whisper. There were other allies who remembered Eleanor's directives and who had not yet sold the company's integrity to Nathaniel's swagger. Marcus Shaw, the CFO, had kept his ledger honest in ways investors liked and men like Nathaniel hated. He had a melancholy about him that often took the form of staying later than anyone else, balancing numbers with the tenderness of someone comforting a child. Lydia Park, the executive assistant Nathaniel trusted to sip his coffee and admire his suits, had, in the quiet hours, a twinned loyalty she would not admit aloud. She had seen what a competent secretary could be, and she resented the way power wore itself like a costume. When Maya reached out to them, quiet dinners, forgotten corners, a message that read, in full, "I would like to talk," they came with foldered notebooks and the kind of caution that people with pensions keep. They did not swear fealty. They adjusted their allegiances in small legal increments. For them, it was not about revenge. It was about rescue, of the company, of the legacy, of the people who had built the structure Nathaniel now used as his stage. The low point arrived with the predictable cruelty of a man who wanted spectacle. Nathaniel scheduled a press conference and, with the dramatic precision of someone who understood optics, announced the company's new direction. He used her absence as a prop, an example of the hard measures necessary for progress. Cameras captured grim-faced trustees and mission statements. An editor's cut later that day looped a headline about internal mismanagement and a photograph of Maya's empty chair. Internet commentary, always thirsty for drama, constructed a narrative in hours, the once faithful aide, ruined by incompetence, now a cautionary tale. Maya watched it unfold like someone reading about a stranger. At home, she made tea that went cold and did not notice. She listened to reports and let their shapes fit into the pastiche she had always expected. She had rehearsed this sense of removal. She had allowed the world to think her vulnerable. But vulnerability is sometimes a veil. There was an accident that people would tell in slightly different versions. Some said she had fainted in the lobby that morning when a delivery of investor packages had come up missing and an angry manager had demanded explanations. Others said she had tripped on the marble steps outside the founder's old office when the press stormed in to take photographs. The truth was smaller and broader. She had pushed her wrist through a glass door that afternoon while leaving a meeting she had not been invited to. The cut was superficial. It bled in the moment and required a lace of stitches, a bandage that made her look like someone who deserved pity. She wore the bandage like an honest concision. Pictures in the tabloids flattered the narrative Nathaniel preferred. Maya, overwhelmed. They did not notice the way her hand still found its way, precise and purposeful, to the photograph with the script on the back. In the weeks following, the office rearranged itself around her absence. People who had once smiled her name now made schedules that excluded it. Nathaniel, for his part, did what powerful men do. He filled the vacuum with public displays. He began to announce charitable initiatives in Maya's name and then never followed through. He beamed at the camera and named Emma as the liaison, praising her fresh perspective. The camera loved that smile. And Emma's visits grew more intimate with Nathaniel. She started attending functions in clothes that glittered and used phrases like "we" when she spoke of future projects. She apologized to Maya in the way people apologize to ancient friends, a delicate, performative guilt that required no structural restitution. Once in the stairwell, Emma touched Maya's arm and said, "I'm so sorry about all of this." It was the kind of apology that completed nothing, like a word that turned the page and left the reader to guess the rest. Maya listened. She filed the touch under data. She kept the memory of Emma's laugh and the curve of her shoulders as one might store the coordinates of an important building. She did not rail. She did not make scenes. She let the humiliation sit as a kind of evidence that others would only later interpret correctly. In the quiet, behind closed doors, she began to assemble what the world had assumed she no longer had. Documentation, witnesses, legal standing. She met with Alden in a room that smelled of old paper and honest coffee. Alden unfolded a packet like a man revealing a map. It contained copies of trust instruments, directives from Eleanor Whitcomb, and a bind of notarized affidavits. There were clauses that protected workers in the event of predatory management. There were also stipulations that allowed a beneficiary named only in code to petition for oversight under certain breaches of corporate stewardship. "This was not left for spectacle," Alden said, tapping a line of type like a metronome. "It was left for moments where stewardship failed." Maya traced the type with her finger. Legal language, dry as it was, felt like a rope. It gave shape to a possibility. It did not guarantee immediate power. Trusts took time, and shareholders had to be handled, and Nathaniel would have lawyers who loved rhetorical flourishes. But it offered a path. She did not act like everyone expected a wronged person to act. Instead of storming justice, she orchestrated patience. She set tests, small lawful provocations that would reveal character. She planted bait that would show who, among the executive circle, preferred principle over profit. She asked Marcus to quietly run an independent audit into a discrete set of financial movements. She asked Lydia, without drama, to make notes during certain meetings that might otherwise be forgotten. She asked Alden to track the chain of custody on key documents. They worked like people who had read history and decided to be on the right side of it. No one shouted. No one broke into anyone's accounts. They relied on the law's patient bureaucracy, the kind that moves slowly and then with iron certainty. Months of small actions followed. Marcus stayed late and produced spreadsheets that looked like love letters to transparency. Lydia took meeting minutes and dated them with a care that made them evidentiary. Alden lodged motions with the trustee and left copies on independent pads. Emma walked further into Nathaniel's orbit, and in that walking she began to forget that loyalty could be a currency. The office's rhythms began to change in ways no one immediately noticed. The sound of heels on marble, once a metronome of arbitrary power, became less about Napoleon walks and more a background percussion to people who were learning the new beat. Maya would sometimes stand in the window at dawn and watch the city arrange itself. The sun would skim the glass building across from them, the one with the founder's name like an altar of brass. And she would think about the old photograph. She did not gloat. She planned. There was one small, delicious moment that no camera caught. It was an ordinary Thursday at 10 in the morning when Nathaniel swaggered into a glassed conference room with his typical flourish and saw, for the first time in months, an assembled room that did not bend to his dramatic pronouncements. Marcus cleared his throat and walked the room through an audit finding with the calmness of someone who had seen numbers as weather. Lydia, sitting by the window, had prepared the minutes in such a way that each of Nathaniel's recent emails was cross-referenced. Nathaniel frowned. His mouth made a small, brittle sound. "Process," Marcus said, like someone naming an inconvenient law. "We need to ensure continuity." The words were banal, but they carried weight. Nathaniel, unused to being interrupted by the architecture of truth, fidgeted. He tried to smile and failed. The room, board members, a couple of uncomfortable investors, and an assistant who had once been called the secretary, kept their mouths shut, and in that silence a new kind of power moved like a current. For Maya, such small humiliations and near misses were instruments to be learned. She wrote notes in the margin of a legal pad and folded them into neat stacks. She did not show her hand, not yet. She mounted each small victory to a larger scaffolding, a trust, a legal precedent, a cadre of people who were not willing to let the company be a stage for a single vain man's ego. So much of theater depends on timing. The final conditions, Alden told her one evening, as rain tapped at the office windows, would crystallize at the right moment. There will be a threshold, he said. A breach, perhaps, that is public enough, and then the instruments will do what they were meant to, protect what they were designed to protect. Maya listened and planned like someone who kept the calendar of a life she hoped to build. She began to practice the public face of power in private. She rehearsed small speeches that were not speeches at all, sentences that simply stated fact. She imagined saying them at a table where more than pity would be forthcoming. She knew that her victory would need to be measured in law and optics, signed documents and the right camera angle. She knew how to order the world slowly. The turning point came piece by piece. Nathaniel's arrogance grew where it had always grown. He misread silence as consent, and then as complicity. He arranged a ceremony in the garden of the company's glass tower, a celebration of a new partnership, a public relations miracle no one had asked for. He announced it with the loudness of someone who thought the story already belonged to him. He invited clients and board members, and subtly, those whose loyalties he wanted to signal. Emma among them, of course, smiling like a woman who had already been promised a role. An invitation arrived for Maya as well. It was printed on heavy stock with the company's embossed crest. On the outer envelope, in Nathaniel's carefully casual hand, were the words, "We'd be honored if you attended." She put the invitation in her drawer next to the old photograph. For a long time she left it there, letting it live with the quiet things she carried. The image of the impending ceremony lodged itself into her plans in a way that made other things seem simpler. Rehearsal dinners are spectacles. They gather names in a room where optics become everything. This one would be public, televised to an audience of industry watchers and a social media tide. It would be a perfect place to reveal truth. The weeks that followed were a study in small, legal manipulations. Maya did not instruct anyone to forge a document or to hack a server. She did not encourage illegal exposure. She built her case on documents that already existed, on the slow application of lawful pressure, and on the inattentive cruelty of a man who thought his jokes were invisible. Each step was mundane in the way the best plans are. Phone calls over coffee, a letter notarized on a rainy afternoon, a shareholder who finally remembered his loyalty was to legacy rather than personality. Emma, not yet seeing that she had traded upward mobility for a moral compromise, grew luminous in Nathaniel's reflection. She bought a dress for the ceremony that was the color of champagne. She wrote a speech that praised bold leadership and practiced delivering it in the mirror. When she and Nathaniel took secret phone calls, the office hummed not with scandal, but with the ordinary mechanical sounds of someone who had climbed. They did not anticipate that all of their publicness would become the very instrument of their undoing. Maya did not move quickly. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had been paid by patience. She catalogued facts and waited for the threshold Alden had mentioned. She let the company tighten around itself. She let the world believe she was gone. She rehearsed a face that would not be surprised when the moment came. In private, she allowed herself the luxury of small pleasures: a walk at dusk, the sound of rain on glass, the careful folding of a paper envelope. The day before the ceremony, she sat in the conference room that had once been the founders, alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The room smelled like varnish and someone else's memories. She opened the small box and took out the photograph. For a moment she let herself imagine a life where no one's power had to be subtracted for justice to matter. Then she folded the paper and slid it into her bag. On the street as she left, a delivery bike crashed into a lamppost and tumbled papers like a small wind. People helped. Apologies flew. The world was messy and ordinary. Nathaniel's laughter echoed on the social feed that night in an edited clip of him making a toast at a rehearsal. Emma's hand rested on his arm like a promise. Maya watched both with the patience of someone who had been cataloging the contents of a house for years. The trust's clauses, Alden's notes, the stacks of minutes Lydia had prepared. These were not theatrical. They were procedural. They would, if arranged correctly, speak the truth in a language the world respected. She was not yet ready to stand in a room and read the law aloud. There would be no dramatic soliloquy at a curtain call. The reveal, when it came, would be surgical and precise. A set of documents slid across a lap with signatures measured and legal consequences immediate. It would be public in the way court records are public. Factual, immutable, and terribly wash-pressed into clarity. That night she locked her apartment and slept in the kind of unfamiliar peace that comes to people who have decided to move as a force of habit. She imagined walking into the ceremony with her hand steady, an envelope under her arm. She imagined watching the cameras align and the world try to narrate her removal as a curiosity. She imagined, too, watching the people who had made her small read the words that said otherwise. Morning arrived cold and bright. Maya dressed in a simple black coat and wore shoes that made no sound on the marble as she walked. The heels on marble, Nathaniel's drum, fell into a softer rhythm. She boarded a cab that smelled faintly of lemon and old leather, and watched the city slide by like a film stripped of color. At the ceremony's garden, the air smelled of summer and perfume and something that people call optimism. Guests clustered under canopies while servers moved like punctuation marks, carrying trays that caught the light. Cameras cut between faces, hungry for the smallest infraction. Nathaniel came in late in his best suit, a man who had forgotten how humility looks. He smiled at cameras and rehearsed a face that had been practiced enough to be indistinguishable from charm. Emma, radiant, found her place at his side. They posed under a trellis of lights like a portrait of a saint. Maya stood in the crowd, an invitation in her coat pocket and a quiet certainty in her chest. She did not move fast. She had given herself the cover of an absence so that the moment she chose to speak, the words would have weight. She watched the room, catalogued the way people leaned, noticed who arrived early and who lingered at the edges. Alden had told her, "Make sure the right people are present. You want witnesses who will not be bought by charm." He had provided a small list, a trustee who had not yet sold his conscience, a journalist who idolized truth, a shareholder with a long memory. They would be present in discreet ways, quietly, like instruments tuned to sound the note when it was necessary. When the speeches began, Nathaniel spoke about growth and culture, painting himself as the company's necessary modernizer. Emma applauded. She framed her words around loyalty and future-facing optimism. The crowd hummed along to the script. Maya let the noise wash like background. She felt only the small, steady tap of her own pulse and the weight of the envelope in her pocket like a legal heart. She was aware of the cameras. Their lenses were hungry, but so was history. Then, a moment before dessert, her phone buzzed. Alden's message read only, "Now." She folded her hands, breathed, and walked toward the table in a manner unremarked by the crowd but precise in its purpose. She did not rush. She did not make a scene. She only moved like someone who finally knew her address. The guests turned. The cameras found a new subject. Nathaniel smiled with the practiced ease of a man prepared to swallow whatever interruption might occur. He did not see the change at first. People tend to miss small things until they are told to look. When they did look, someone in the crowd, an attentive journalist, lifted a phone and began to stream. The garden's lights seemed to focus like a spotlight, and the moment snapped into high definition. Maya came to the front with a calm that redefined the word. She set the envelope on the table and opened it with an economy that made the sound of paper into something like authority. Inside were certified copies, trust instruments, notarized affidavits, a chain of signatures that would make an auditor smile and a bluffer's grin wilt. The reaction was not immediate thunder. It unfurled like a careful unspooling of fact. Faces shifted. Nathaniel's smile faltered. It lost its rehearsed line and became honest hunger. Emma's hand tightened on his arm like someone trying to hold on to a thing that had no grasp. Maya read, not loudly but clearly, the name of the trust, the legal standing, the clause Eleanor had penned and sealed. She read the succinct statement that named a beneficiary on conditions that had now been met. The words she spoke were not victory cries. They were surgical. By the authority vested in the Whitcomb family trust, and in accordance with the provisions set forth in the founder's codicil, I petition for oversight and immediate review of current executive stewardship. There was a pause in which the summer air felt like glass. Cameras leaned in. Nathaniel opened his mouth and closed it, as if he had no script for a page that required law. She did not shout accusation. She did not smear his face with the details of his arrogance. She had chosen dignity, clean, legal, precise. The documents were not a sermon. They were a mandate. The guests murmured. Phones recorded. Somewhere a string quartet faltered, and then found a new chord. The metaphor of heels on marble had shifted. The sound now belonged to walking into consequence rather than walking out of it. This was the moment where histories begin to tilt. The right eyes caught the signatures and the notary stamps. The shareholder who had been so easily persuaded by Nathaniel's optimism remembered, with a new and sour clarity, a lifetime of building a thing that had once meant more than a smiling CEO. Marcus stood, with a folded packet he had prepared in secret, and walked to the table. Lydia, who had written minutes with the care of a witness, stepped forward. But none of that happened all at once. Power is a slow animal. The crowd did not rise in unanimous epiphany. Instead, it rippled. Concern here, confusion there, a few delighted whispers that finally truth had arrived at the party. Nathaniel's face, a map of tempers and surprises, became the first signal. He laughed then, an attempt at levity that found no purchase. Emma paled. The cameras rolled. And then, the moment before the tide, Maya felt the world narrow to a single fact: that laws are patient in a way vindication rarely is. She felt, for the first time in months, the precise, cold delight of righteous timing. She was not done. Not yet. There were votes to be taken, lawyers to consult, and a company to be shepherded away from a man who thought clothes could make him monarch. But the first thread had been pulled. The garden noise softened into a new kind of silence, the kind that waits for the next sound to tell it what to be. Maya held the photograph that had followed her into ruin and up to this table. She smiled, not triumphantly, but like someone who had finally found the right key. Across the table, Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Emma's eyes flicked like a bird's. The cameras shifted frames. Somewhere in the room, a waiter dropped a plate, and the shattering sounded like punctuation. It was, when it began, a small unfolding. It would soon become larger. The legal machinery would move with the deliberate speed of law. People would choose sides. Investors would count their options. Social feeds would spin this into 10,000 narrations. Maya folded the photograph back into the envelope and closed the lid. She did not gloat. She straightened her coat and let a silence speak for her. The next steps, both larger and smaller, were waiting. She could see them from here. Shareholder meetings, council rooms, the slow unweaving of a man's public illusions. She turned away from the table and stepped back into the crowd, the envelope like a small, heavy heart in her hand. The heels on marble continued their chorus, now punctuated by the soft, steady tap of someone who knew where she was going. The garden's applause had not yet found its way into consequence when the first emails arrived. Quiet, official, the sort of notes that move through institutions with the chill of circulation lists. Marcus's message arrived like a taut thread. Emergency convening. Trustee documentation attached. Lydia sent minutes she had never shown publicly before. Dated entries, timestamps, the small, steady proof of attention. Alden's note was terse. Prepared filings will be served at 900 tomorrow. Expect quick counsel. Nathaniel read them on a phone that suddenly felt too loud in his hand. He scrolled, smiled for the cameras, and then his face dissolved into a look that had not been on him since the early growth days when mistakes still taught humility. He called his PR firm and talked fast in a language designed to reframe honesty as misinterpretation. He phoned a board member and promised an immediate, thorough response. He paced. The marble beneath his shoes no longer sounded like applause. It sounded like the floor of a cage. The first legal moves were methodical rather than theatrical, exactly what Maya and her allies had intended. Alden filed a petition with the trustee to enforce oversight. The petition cited clauses in the Whitcomb family trust, that allowed for the appointment of an independent stewardship committee when certain breaches of fiduciary duty occurred. Marcus delivered an independent audit summary to anonymous financial press contacts and to a small group of prudent investors. The summary was clinical, showing inconsistencies in transactions that begged explanation. Lydia provided sworn minutes verifying a series of internal memos Nathaniel had issued without board approval. The documents did not shout. They simply existed, and in the modern world, facts that sit quietly are often the deadliest kind of truth. A ripple of investor caution unpeeled into a small wave. A few key funds froze new disbursements pending governance review. Analysts shifted their tone from praise to cautionary notes. In the offices where Nathaniel once strode like a featured headline, conversations turned to contingency models. On the company's social feed, the clip of Maya's measured reading of the trust instruments was already circulating. People rewound and listened to the legal phrasing as if it were a confession of what the company might have become. Nathaniel tried to counter with charm and speed. He released a statement pledging transparency, promised an internal review, and positioned his immediate circle as willing to cooperate. His lawyers sent a brief demanding that the trustee delay any precipitous action until they could consult. The language was protective, the tone steeped in calm indignation. He arranged interviews in which he performed contrition with the practiced theatricality of someone used to being believed. But he was late to the architecture of real proof. Legal instruments are not easily dismissed with a smiling press release. The trustee, Alden had reminded Maya, was constrained by duty. Once a petition is lodged, the trustee must weigh it against statutory fiduciary obligations. There were, if the facts were as represented, grounds for immediate interim oversight. The trustee was neither heroic nor vindictive. He was an executor of law, and law moves on the currency of documents. A shareholder called an emergency meeting. Notices went out overnight, proxies were gathered. For Maya, the quiet work of months began to unfurl into rooms that smelled of varnish and coffee and people trying to remember the commitments they had made a decade earlier. The shareholders were a mix. Old loyalists who remembered the founder's hands-on ethic, opportunistic investors whose primary appetite was numbers, and board members who had once seen themselves as stewards and now wondered what stewardship required in practical terms. At home, Emma slept poorly for the first time in months. In a mirror she practiced a different face, the apology face, the contrite one. She had privately imagined a future where she would speak cleanly about ambition and partnership. The press had not yet reached into the tender places where guilt sits heavy, but Emma felt that weight like a tide. She had told herself that she would help Nathaniel steer the company forward, that the compromises were transactional and temporary. She had not anticipated the way those transactions would become a ledger of her conscience. When Maya arrived at the special meeting, an austere room set for voting, she walked with the same quiet that had carried her to the front table in the garden. Marcus presented the audit with the patience of someone reading weather patterns. The numbers, laid out, bled a different story. Expense accounts that had been inflated, charitable donations promised and never made, a quiet funneling of perks into people close to the executive office. The shareholders listened. Some closed their eyes, some rubbed at the bridge of their noses. An investor who had once fawned at executive banquets now leaned forward and asked the direct question, "Were any board approvals falsified?" Lydia stood then and recited minutes with the kind of professional cadence no theater can replicate. Dates, times, who was present, and who had been deliberately excluded. The weight of ordinary administrative care turned into a witness. It was not salacious, it was structural. More damning than accusations were the steadily compiled facts that showed a pattern. Decisions made with thin oversight and the favoring of influence over legacy. Nathaniel's rebuttal, when it came, was an attempt to reframe motive. He spoke of vision and progress. He argued that the founder, had she lived, would have preferred decisive action to paralyzing bureaucracy. He smiled in the right places. A few younger board members, who had been borrowed from venture houses and craved the trappings of a modern CEO, nodded. But the room contained older faces as well. People who had stood with Eleanor Whitcomb through 1,000 small defeats and triumphs and who felt now the sting of a bargain broken. The trustee, after reviewing the filings and the audit, invoked the trust's emergency oversight clause. The vote that followed was not theatrical. Proxies were counted. Paper ballots were collected. The margin was not a landslide, but it was decisive. The shareholders voted to appoint an independent stewardship committee tasked with immediate review and temporary control over discretionary executive actions. Nathaniel was suspended from day-to-day operational authority pending the committee's full review. It was a surgical removal, the sort that happens in law firms and boardrooms, and rarely in the bright glare of social feeds. The garden's hush transformed into a legal exhale. News outlets wrote the story with a cautious, astonished tone. Social feeds filled with clips of Maya's reading, of Nathaniel's flustered interview clips, of Emma's staged smiles. Hashtags curled into trending threads. The company's stock price that week took the sort of corrective dip that sends senior executives to their advisors. Markets are motives, and investors treat a governance risk like a contagion. For Nathaniel, the practical consequences arrived with the immediacy of bank calls and covenant reviews. Lenders queued questions about credit lines. Partners postponed announcements. The infrastructure Nathaniel had treated as extension of his persona suddenly acted like the sober machinery of consequence. Public humiliation, when it is joined to legal consequence, is not an entertainment. It is a remediation. It is meant to correct risk. For the people who had worked under Nathaniel's shadow, it felt like a mop finally being drawn across too much spilled ink. For some, the relief was immediate. For others, there was a fear that the company's brand might fracture beyond repair. Emma's personal nadir came not on camera, but in a hallway where she found Maya by accident, an elevator between floors, the hum of the building an indifferent third presence. She looked smaller than her photos had suggested, paler, the makeup of a woman who had been on many stages but who now felt the rawness of being watched. Emma started. Apologies have many forms. This one was a sentence that broke and then reshaped itself. I should have done things differently. I didn't think. I only thought about what it would mean for me. Her voice faltered. She was not asking for absolution. She was asking, perhaps paradoxically, for the one human response that might smooth the contours of her shame. Maya had imagined this meeting dozens of times and also not at all. She had held a place for many possible versions of Emma, defiant, regretful, indifferent. Emma's face that day seemed remorseful in a way that humbled the earlier betrayals. You made choices, Maya said, not unkind but without softening the facts. You are allowed to have made them, but choices have consequences. Emma's eyes filled. She reached out, as if for a familiar touch, and then stopped herself. I'm sorry, Maya. I didn't see how much you'd given everything. I never wanted to hurt you. It wasn't about wanting, Maya replied. It was about who we choose to show up as when the cameras are off. They stood in the elevator as the doors opened, neither of them particularly composed. Emma's contrition was not the kind that erased the ledger. It was a small human admission. Maya listened, and in listening, she performed the dignity she had cultivated. No public spectacle, no relish in ruin. She accepted the apology and accepted that acceptance did not translate into trust restored overnight. Meanwhile, the stewardship committee began its work. It was composed of a small group of independent directors, a representative from the trustee, and 2 external auditors. Their charge was immediate and precise. Review executive decisions of the past 18 months, evaluate the company's governance protocols, and put in place interim controls to prevent impropriety. Marcus remained on the payroll and volunteered to act as liaison. His presence calmed investors who wanted a number-savvy face they could trust. The committee's early decisions were practical and patient. They froze certain discretionary bonus pools pending review, ordered several vendor relationships re-examined, and requested a transparent public report to be issued within 30 days. That public report, when released, carried the force of auditors and showed a series of poor governance choices and insufficient oversight. It did not frame every decision as sin. It framed many as the result of concentrated authority without sufficient checks. The PR fights Nathaniel launched were effective at obscuring nuance for a few days. He marshaled an array of sympathetic narratives, talk of rapid growth burdens, of mistakes made in the name of expansion, and some opinion pieces opined that the market punished decisive leaders too harshly. But the committee's report had the imprimatur of independence, and for investors the law and independent audits matter more than op-eds. The stock stabilized only after a deeper, slower correction. Quick narratives were replaced by contractual reviews and boardroom counsel. Nathaniel, who had once treated charm as currency, felt his access narrow. A few of his staunchest allies walked away quietly, uncomfortable with the fiscal implications and unwilling to risk their own reputations. He issued a public statement that read as wounded dignity, then hired counsel to explore options. Legal advisors counseled restraint. A public spat would not help if investigators looked more closely at internal accounting and the committee's findings. There were legal inquiries that followed, regulatory notices about potential disclosure issues, questions about how certain transactions were recorded. These were not dramatic indictments. They were the machinery of oversight doing its job. Nathaniel's legal team argued and maneuvered. The case did not resolve overnight. It would take months, perhaps years, and therein lay another of the story's ironies. Reputational collapses often outlast legal determinations. For Maya, the work after the reveal was no less substantial than the reveal itself. She did not walk in and become a triumphant CEO with a ribboned office and a staff that lauded her. Instead, she took meetings, reviewed committee charters, and listened to the people whose livelihoods depended on stability. She asked questions, and the difference between a question asked from a place of ownership versus from a place of grievance became the difference between a leader and a claimant. She was offered a formal role on the committee, an executive observer with powers meant to ensure the founder's mission endured. There was an argument, private and careful, about optics. Some wanted her to be the public face of restitution, a heroine for narrative outlets. She declined to be the mere symbol. Instead, she accepted a seat that gave her real oversight authority, voting rights on certain stewardship decisions, and the right to call for the review of executive appointments. Her approach was surgical and steady. She focused on restoring employee trust, convening listening sessions, approving a whistleblower hotline that bypassed centralized executive control, and championing a transparent reinstatement policy for mid-level employees dislocated by the turmoil. She insisted on policies that prevented the concentration of discretionary power. She asked Marcus to design an incentive structure tied to long-term performance and ethical benchmarks. She asked Alden to draft governance language that would make it harder for future executives to privatize power under the cover of vision. The company's culture shifted incrementally. People who had been cowed by Nathaniel's larger-than-life posture found space to speak. Employees who had been wary about reporting missteps began to use the hotline. A small team was set up to audit contractor relationships that had been vaporous in their deliverables. It was slow and not entirely clean, but it was meaningful. As for Emma, the public consequences were immediate and personal. She issued a statement acknowledging her errors of judgment and stepping back from public-facing roles. There was, in the social sphere, a predictable cycle of scorn. People on feeds pronounced their verdicts. Late-night comedians made neat sketches. But whether one thought her punishment adequate or insufficient, the private shame she carried was sharper than any public ridicule. She requested a meeting with the employees she had once managed, attended a small formal session, and listened as people named the pain she had helped inflict. She offered direct apologies, and though some accepted, others were less willing to forgive. That, too, is part of consequence. Maya observed Emma's contrition with a quiet that some read as magnanimity and others read as indifference. In truth, it was neither. Forgiveness, in Maya's view, was not an eraser but a new way to proceed. She believed that justice included restoration when possible and accountability when required. Emma's role, once bright and certain, would now be a smaller thing, an opportunity to rebuild reputation through service rather than spectacle. Whether she could do it remained to be seen. Nathaniel, deprived of his operational throne, became a cautionary tale in corridors and on feeds. He hired reputation counsel who advised measured statements and behind-the-scenes coalition building. He argued in private that he had been acting in the company's best interest. The committee and the trustee had the burden of proof. The trustees had the advantage of documents. The months that followed felt like an unspooling of decisions and consequences. Some of Nathaniel's supporters returned to the fold once actions were regularized. Others did not. One evening, months after the garden reveal, Maya walked alone through the old part of the office where the founder had once presided. The wood-scented hallway had a quiet that kept the sound of heels distant. She found Agnes sitting in a chair near a window, knitting something small and undecorated. "You did it," Agnes said simply, as if she had always known. Her eyes had the kind of softness that accrues to people who have seen the arc of decades. "We did what we had to," Maya replied. She was precise with pronouns now. There was a coalition, a committee, a trustee, and many small people who had stood up. People who had not once spoken on camera, but who had spent hours in the pragmatic labor of repair. Agnes smiled. Eleanor would have liked that. Maya thought of the photograph in her drawer, of the founder's handwriting that had trusted her to a day when it would matter. She thought of the seasons she had counted in silence. "I like that too," she said. The post-reveal months were not tidy chapters. There were legal settlements to be negotiated, there were staff changes, and a public relations healing process that demanded both patience and courage. A few employees who had been deeply harmed by the old regime received compensation and new roles. The company's mission statement was revised to include explicit commitments to governance and employee protections. Shareholders, slowly reassured, engaged differently. The board itself went through a modest reconstitution with a stronger network of independent directors. At a closed-door meeting, formal but peppered with the quiet gratitude of people who had been close to losing more than a name, Maya made a brief statement. Her voice did not seek to punish, it sought to enjoin. "We did not come here to make a spectacle of anyone," she said. "We came here to ensure that the company Eleanor built is stewarded in a way that honors the people who actually built it. Respect and oversight are not sentimental things. They are work." Her words landed as policies. They were backed by votes and by the architecture of governance Alden had helped draft. They became, over time, the scaffolding that steadied a company that had been reoriented by courage and patient legality. Nathaniel eventually resigned from the executive chair. His name remained on letterhead for a time, an artifact of a moment when charisma had been mistaken for competency. He moved into a consultancy role he called advisor, which offered him an acceptable exit, while allowing the company to close the chapter with as little theater as possible. Some regarded the arrangement as too polite, others thought it prudent. For Maya, it was neither victory nor vindication. It was the quiet of a system mending its own tears. Emma took an unpaid sabbatical. She enrolled in ethics classes, not the performative sort, but the sorts that require essays and tests and the rebuilding of habits. She volunteered in a small program the company funded that supported mid-career women returning to the workforce. The work was small. It was, as Maya had learned, the kind of repair that insists on humility. Maya's own notoriety grew in ways she did not court. Profile pieces, focusing on the trustee instruments and the cunning patience that had produced the reveal, wrote about her as if she were a parable. The headlines sometimes miss the nuance. They like dramatic verbs and simple nouns. But the people who mattered, the staff, the trustees, the investors who stayed because they believed in purpose, understood that her work was neither a scorched earth revenge nor a triumphant coronation. It was stewardship. Months later, at a modest ceremony honoring long-serving employees, Maya gave a short address. She spoke not of revenge, but of endurance. She said, to applause that came warm and measured, "Dignity is quieter than most people expect. It doesn't need a microphone. It needs consistency." Afterwards, a young assistant approached her with wide eyes and an old notebook. "You change things," she said. "People feel safer." Maya looked at the girl, thinking of the days when she had been unseen. "Safety is the work of many hands," she replied. "You keep building it." The company slowly regained its market footing, not by shortcuts but through incremental, steady performance and an insistence on transparency. Investors who had left returned only after the governance reforms were proven effective. The founder's legacy, once under the threat of being reduced to a corporate anecdote, found a sturdier place in the company's identity. Maya's relationship with power had shifted. She did not desire to rule like a monarch. She created a small internal fund for employee education, inspired by the founder's belief that opportunity should not depend on spectacle. She did not take the chief executive title. She preferred a place where her oversight was real but not performative, an anchor of steady legal stewardship. It gave her room to breathe and to let others grow into roles with accountability. One afternoon, as autumn slipped into the city's veins and the light on the glass tower had the bright, cool edge of seasonal change, Alden called her into his old office. The man who had once been the family's quiet counsel now moved with a slow contentment. He handed her a letter, simple, unadorned. "It's from the executor," he said. "A donation request, unsurprisingly, for a community program Eleanor once considered." Maya read the note and smiled. It was small, domestic, the kind of bureaucracy that quietly stitches legacy to practice. A little fund to sponsor apprenticeships and to give people whom the old structures often overlooked a chance to learn. "You made the right choice," Alden said. "Not everyone would have used that power so well." She shrugged in a way that admitted her pride without making it a spectacle. "I had good people," she said, "and a good rule book." Their laughter was modest, the kind that lives in the small places behind great things. As the year closed, the office no longer centered around one man's untouchable persona. The sound of heels on marble continued, but it was joined by other sounds. Comfortable clacks of keyboards, quiet conversations about mentorship, the steady hum of a company that had learned to value structure over spectacle. In the end, the public story that had once been about humiliation became a lesson not about the fragility of a single person's dignity, but about the resilience of systems when stewarded by people who remember that institutions are not props, but obligations. Nathaniel's arrogance had been the catalyst, yes, but it was the patient adherence to law and care, the small people who kept the minutes, the auditor who stayed late, the trustee who executed duty, that had produced the remedy. Maya kept the photograph in a new place, a modest frame on a shelf in her small new office, away from the press and the podiums. It was no longer a relic of waiting, but a reminder of stewardship. Sometimes she took it down and looked at the handwriting on the back, Eleanor's scrawl like a covenant. She had been called the secretary for years, a label that had once shrunk her. Now, when people addressed her, they used her name with a different weight. That, too, was no small thing. The last public act she made as a member of the stewardship committee was not dramatic. It was a vote to fund a transparency initiative that required regular, accessible reports to employees and shareholders. Not flashy communications, but clear, readable summaries of how decisions were made and how money moved. It was exactly the kind of tedious bureaucracy that saves institutions from themselves. When reporters later tried to compress the story into tidy moral lessons, they reached for aphorisms. Some called it a tale of poetic justice. Others wrote about patience as power. Maya, who had lived both humiliation and vindication, kept the moral simple in private. She said when asked by a colleague what she thought mattered most, "Don't confuse motion for progress. Be patient, be careful, and keep your receipts." Weeks later, on a quiet night, she walked home with the steady rhythm of shoes on pavement. The city hummed. The noise of the week receded like a tide. She passed a small cafe where people read and laughed. She felt the weight of the envelope no longer in her bag, but settled into the architecture of her life. There had been losses, relationships that could not be fully repaired, and scars that paper and law could not erase. But there was also a work that had been done, practical and lawful and human. At the end of the year, the company released an annual report that, for the first time in a long while, spent more pages on governance and employee welfare than on executive vision. It was not the sort of thing that trended. It was the sort of thing that mattered. Maya stood by her window one evening and watched the city's lights. She thought of the woman in the photograph and of a life that had once seemed written by other hands. She thought of small likes and small offices and the patient law that had kept a promise. "Dignity," she murmured, not as a slogan but as a steady statement. Behind her, on a small table, the framed photograph caught the light. She walked over, touched the frame, and carried it with her to a drawer where she kept the documents that mattered. Minutes, signed clauses, the trust instruments that had been, in the end, instruments of stewardship rather than revenge. When asked in a later interview whether she felt vindicated, she answered with the nuance that had been her signature. "Vindication," she said, "is not a crowning. It's correction." That was the goal, to correct the course, protect the people, and see that the company remembers its own history. Her expression did not seek applause. It sought something simpler, a future where the sound of heels on marble would not be a metronome of arbitrary power but simply another footfall in a room full of work. And somewhere in the city, a young administrative assistant filed a report with care because she had seen someone do it well and because, for the first time, she believed the minutes might matter. If this story struck you, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in Maya's place? And if you want more character-driven tales of patience, consequence, and quiet triumph, subscribe for the next story.